There have been many injustices in this world, but today I am very happy to report that Dana Rivers has been sentenced to life in prison without parole. For several years after the brutal murders of Charlotte Reed, Patricia Wright, and their 19-year-old son, Benny Wright, the case received little news coverage or national attention. This is despite the case having all the markers of a hate crime. Rivers was a participant of Camp Trans, which sought to force lesbians holding the women's only Midgefest festival to include men, a festival which both Patricia and Charlotte regularly attended. Despite the murders occurring only a year after the last Midgefest event, as well as the identities of the victims in relation to Rivers protesting, this was not mentioned or covered in the trial. The state instead chose to argue that Rivers murdered Reed for leaving a motorcycle club that they'd both been a part of due to his role of enforcer. Kara Densky has been reporting on this case since it became apparent that justice would be a drawn-out process, and I am thankful for her diligent reporting, which makes this video possible. As we previously discussed in an interview, that Rivers was a trans activist likely served as one of the reasons why this case did not receive widespread attention. It's important to note that many cases wherein trans activists or trans individuals commit crimes, those cases are not covered by mainstream press or are covered in a biased manner that does not truthfully illustrate the pattern of male violence that connects them. In many cases, it seems like suppression, which leaves only those who are gender critical or trans critical, a meaningful distinction, to admit to the severity of these occurrences. Rivers committed a horrible and planned murder, wherein he brought a silencer to the scene, used latex gloves, and took the time to use multiple weapons. A month later, he reported to his brother that his life had never been more in control than it was that night. Despite being found guilty of 3 counts of murder on November 15, 2022, justice was continually drawn out while his lawyer tried to argue for an insanity claim. The use of violence against a sleeping family, found dead in their pajamas, seems to go against this claim. Rivers first shot Benny to death and then went for Charlotte and Patricia while they were in bed sleeping, half-clothed. He shot and stabbed them both mercilessly. His treatment of Charlotte was particularly dreadful. He stabbed her a total of 44 times after shooting her twice. California does not require a motive to be proven for a conviction, and there was enough evidence to support the conclusion that Rivers committed these murders by way of either premeditation or deliberation or lying in wait, or both, making it first-degree murder. However, prosecutors were specific in painting the picture of motorcycle gang violence and ignored the possibility of targeting based on the victims' lesbian identities. The amount of force used to murder Charlotte over that of her wife and child seems to illustrate a fixation, as does Rivers being found wearing Charlotte's clothes. It also makes the continued use of preferred pronouns especially impactful, as even though Rivers' biological sex was noted through DNA evidence, continuing to refer to him as female served to further obfuscate the motives and pattern of violence seen in this case. Densky speculates on both the motive for the trial as well as why it occurred so quickly. She writes, "Now, after listening to the closing arguments, I think I was right, and I think something else too. I think that Rivers' motive for killing Charlotte was that he didn't think she ought to be allowed to exist if he could not be her. His brutal attacks on her body belie a level of savage hatred and narcissistic rage that far exceeds most murders, and that exceeded his murder of Patricia and Benny. He needed her to die, and part of his reasoning could have been that she had left the motorcycle club, as the state argued. However, to completely ignore the role of misogyny serves not only to put the women he may be housed with at risk, but denies the pattern of woman-hating by trans-identified males. The attempt to claim mental health as an excuse for what was clearly male hatred of women, commonly seen amongst trans-identified males through a variety of threatening and misogynistic online posts and behaviors, was thankfully unsuccessful. His attorney has filed for a retrial, but as of June 17, 2023, his sentence remains upheld. During this part of the trial, notes from the courtroom, again reported by Densky, reads as follows. Today's witness was Dr. Amy Watt, a psychologist in private practice hired by the state to interview and evaluate Rivers. She spent around 3 to 4 hours in person at the Santa Rita jail with Rivers, evaluating him and conducting a multitude of tests, including those covering personality, cognition, IQ, and memory. She noted several significant details about her interview with Rivers. The evaluation was unusually long due to Rivers' extensive and detailed answers. He was able to give a complete and detailed life, medical, and mental health history with ease. She described it as if he was reading from a book, which was very rare in her experience. He was able to go into extensive detail about prior traumatic events, but could not describe the events of the night of the murders. Parts of his memory tests were scored above average. He was very dramatic in his presentation. He had a long history of interpersonal conflicts and angry outbursts. Members of the Deviants Motorcycle Club were involved with some of these, such as when no one wanted to room with him during an overnight trip. Victim Charlotte Reed seemed to be especially an issue for him, although why was not discussed. On a test where he was shown an image of a woman lying in bed with a man standing away from her, with his hand covering his face, he was asked to provide a story about what he thought was happening in the image. Instead of a story, he provided a thought for the male image. I told that B I would kill her, the man thought after the fact. After her examination and reviewing the extensive records, she concurred with his previous diagnoses via the VA of PTSD, anxiety, depression, and borderline personality disorder. She saw no signs of psychosis, flashbacks, or dissociation currently or in his history. She also saw no signs of memory issues or cognitive impairment. She concluded that he had showed no signs of psychosis or dissociation the night of the murders and was sane under California law at the time. She came to that conclusion by way of his calm demeanor and many remarks at the crime scene that he was aware of what had happened and that he knew he was in trouble. She also agreed with the prosecution that him coming to the scene with a loaded weapon with a silencer, using latex gloves, and setting the garage on fire showed planning. Defense tried to use Dr. Watt's testimony about the extensive ways she uses multiple tests and strictly in-person interviews to impeach Dr. Howard's much leaner evaluation of Rivers. Dr. Watt noted that every clinician is different and that there is no one right way to do an evaluation done professionally. Adams repeatedly tried to press that a combination of PTSD and borderline personality disorder might cause dissociation or psychosis to look differently, but Dr. Watts rejected that theory. Defense theory that Rivers could have been triggered by an aggressive interaction that could have caused him to have a PTSD flashback response and violently act out without knowing what he did or remembering it was also rejected by Dr. Watt, who said people experiencing such a flashback would usually look to get to safety or retreat into themselves, not act out. Regardless of the victims of the crimes committed, there has been a trend, especially in states such as California, of allowing trans-identified males to be housed in female prisons. Not only does this put incarcerated women at risk and has already resulted in reported rapes and pregnancies, but it continues to illustrate a pattern of placing men's feelings over women's safety. It denies dignity to the victims, whose deaths will not be accurately reported on as a result of pronoun preference, and classifies Rivers as a being of the same sex as them. While Rivers was sent to San Quentin, a male prison for processing, as Redux notes, it is not likely to last. SB 132, also known as the Transgender Respect Agency and Dignity Act, was signed into effect in January of 2021 by California Governor Gavin Newsom. The law provides inmates housing based on their self-declared gender identity status. Almost immediately after the legal guideline went into effect, California correctional centers were hit with hundreds of transfer requests from male inmates seeking movement into women's facilities. The California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation has previously confirmed to Redux that prison transfer requests are based entirely off of a gender identity questionnaire that could be issued during reception or requested by the inmate at any time during their incarceration. So while it is a victory that Rivers is prosecuted and his crimes will be punished, we will have to wait to see where he'll end up serving his sentence, as well as if the broader reporting community will finally wake up to the nature of crimes such as this one. This, dear viewers, is where we part. I hope that I gave enough respect to this case, because it is one that I've been thinking about since I first heard about it a while ago. It's one that I've kept up with, and I wanted to wait until we had, sense of finality before I did any kind of video on it or an update. And I'm really, really hoping that I don't have to do one in the future that says, oh, he was allowed into a female prison. But considering that it's California and considering how California has worked with trans inmates to allow them to be with incarcerated women, I don't really have high hopes. I will leave my personal feelings on people who commit crimes out of this video, but I think that a male prison would be best because male prisoners tend to be meaner than female prisoners, and I'll leave it there. If you have any comments, questions, or concerns, please leave them down below, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.